a real pleasure for me to deliver this Williamson Memorial Lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about Williamson, but also I want to talk about a topic that's very much in the news today and is greatly informed by Williamson's insights, and that's issues related to the economics of platforms and data privacy. As I'm sure you know, the US antitrust authorities filed a suit against Google this week, something that's been discussed for a long time. The heads of the major social media platforms have been called before Congress to testify many times about how they're protecting privacy, how they're, to what extent they're engaged in anti-competitive, so-called anti-competitive behavior. Of course, you have the same thing going on in Europe. So I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about some of those issues today in the context of Williamson and Williamson's writings. So I'm very happy to be joining you remotely from Texas, which is a land that is moderately high in economic freedom, perhaps almost as high as Denmark, but not quite in some measures. Actually, we don't have any local income tax. We have no state level income tax, which pushes us way up in the economic freedom indexes. And as you may have heard, a lot of companies, including tech companies, are relocating from California, mainly to Texas, but also to places that are in the US that are more, how shall I say, more friendly towards business, which California these days is not. I wish I could join you in person in Copenhagen, which is one of my favorite cities to visit. Unfortunately, this is 2020, so we have to do things the 2020 way. So I appreciate the video, Stefan, that you prepared and that you shared. I was going to say just a few brief remarks about Williamson himself, just to echo some of the things that were on your better designed, more attractively formatted video. Williamson did pass away this year in 2020. He is, in my mind, one of the great social scientists of the 20th century, ranking 20th and early 21st century, ranking up there with people who were his friends and colleagues and teachers, such as Ronald Coase and Herbert Simon. Williamson did come out of what he described as the Carnegie tradition, receiving his PhD at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon was in the 1960s, when Williamson was a student, late 50s, early 60s, was kind of the hotbed of what now might be described as behavioral social science. People were interested in cognition, how the mind works, more realistic views of behavior than the ones that you got in the sterile kind of neoclassical economics models of the day. So besides Herbert Simon, who was kind of a giant figure at Carnegie Mellon, you had people like Richard Syrett, who was Williamson's dissertation advisor, and Jim March, the famous sociologist. March and Simon's book is one of the most famous contributions to social thought of the late 20th century. So that's kind of the milieu in which Williamson intellectually grew up, interdisciplinary, high priority placed on intellectual curiosity and really trying to find creative new answers to important problems. He was very distinguished, had a very important career, was at the University of Pennsylvania and at Yale and at Berkeley, where I was his student. He also spent a time working as a special assistant to the head of the antitrust division at the US Department of Justice, working on cases related to competition and monopoly. I'll touch on that in just a moment. I think that experience greatly informed his thinking on firms and industries and markets. And as Stefan mentioned, he was a Nobel laureate, receiving the award in 2009, along with Elinor Ostrom. Williamson is mainly known for his theory of transaction costs, or what is sometimes called transaction cost economics, which has many, many applications, including applications to antitrust and regulation, also to organizational economics, strategic management. Williamson is one of the founders, along with Ronald Coase and Douglas North, of what has come to be known as the new institutional economics. More formally, he was those three giants and Nobel laureates co-founded an organization which was originally called the International Society for New Institutional Economics, but has since changed its name to the Society for Institutional and Organizational Economics. Got to make sure I get that right. SIOE. So if you're interested in learning more about this field, you could check out the SIOE, this society, which holds an annual conference, puts out papers and so forth. And Williamson was also an important mentor and a teacher. I myself, along with, I don't know, a dozen or so colleagues in my same cohort, late 80s, early 90s, a lot of those people, I won't speak for myself, but my colleagues have gone on to become very prominent scholars in business schools, teaching organizational economics and strategy and competition theory and so forth. So there's a large group of us affectionately known as the Berkeley Mafia. Here's a picture of myself with Oliver right after he won the Nobel Prize. We had a party at his house. A lot of his former students, including myself, showed up at his house, and there I am holding the actual Nobel Prize. So I have not won a Nobel Prize. I don't think it's very likely that I will win a Nobel Prize, but I have touched a Nobel Prize, or at least I've touched the outside of the box in which the Nobel Prize is housed. Actually, to be more specific, I learned that when you win the Nobel Prize, they actually give you two. You get two medals, right? One is the actual Nobel medal, which is made of solid gold, I guess, but you put that in a safe. They also give you a display copy that you can, leave out in your home. So this is actually the fake that I'm holding. So yeah, it's not really the Nobel Prize, but I came close to holding the fake Nobel Prize. What are transaction costs? There's a lot of discussion of transaction costs in the academic literature and practitioner literature. You think of writing contracts and finding people to trade with and haggling over prices and other terms and making sure your trading partners perform as expected. So for example, when Sipos invited me to give this lecture, we had some discussion about, the date of the conference and how many lectures I would deliver and whether there would be some compensation and whether we would do it in person or over Zoom. And, we had some, I wouldn't call it haggling exactly, but we certainly had some conversations back and forth. Then we had kind of a formal agreement. And if either of us had failed to perform as expected, there would be some repercussions. I mean, all of those, the costs of doing all those things have to be factored into our economic analysis of what we do and how we do it and when we're successful. And a lot of scholars, including Ronald Coase, had described these transaction costs and the roles that they play. But it was Williamson who developed an entire, what you might call a transaction cost theory of the firm, a transaction cost theory of the market, of industries, or what Williamson himself called transaction cost economics, or TCE. If you like, you can think of TCE as elaborating on or operationalizing the three classic questions posed by Ronald Coase in his 1937 paper, The Nature of the Firm. Why do firms exist? What explains the internal organization of the firm? And what are the limits or boundaries to the firm? And some of the famous contributions from the 1970s and 1980s were all about sort of answering or putting some flesh on the skeleton that was suggested by Coase. I think most of Williamson's contributions, at least in one perspective, relate to the boundaries of the firm, though his work also has something to say about existence and internal organization. So to put it another way, what exactly is TCE? What is transaction cost economics? Well, there's sort of a narrow view of what it is and also a broader view. The narrower view would describe TCE as offering a specific theory for the vertical boundaries of the firm. And this theory hinges upon the core construct of asset specificity, which I'll explain in just a moment. So a narrow view of TCE would call it the asset specificity explanation for vertical integration. But Williamson took a much broader view. he thought that TCE offered really a grand unified theory of economic organization that could be applied to many, many different contexts. And I tend to think Williamson was right. He's best known for several articles, some of which were collected in 3 very well-known books. Probably his best-known book is his 1975 work called Markets and Hierarchies, which was the first to kind of lay out many of these transaction cost considerations. His 1985 book, The Economic Institutions of Capitalism, is one of the all-time bestsellers in economics, ranking right up there with Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others in terms of number of books sold and citations received and so forth. And then his last book was his 96th book called The Mechanisms of Governance. If you want some indication of influence, I just looked up, if you look up in Google Scholar, that's a tool that we professors use to track citations to academic papers. His book, Markets and Hierarchies, has, as of yesterday, 44,868 citations on Google Scholar. His book, Economic Institutions of Capitalism, I don't know why it pulled up this weird German text, but that's the citation, that's the Google Scholar entry for the book, came up with 51,202 citations. Now, for those of you who are not economics professors or academics, you might think, well, I don't know what these numbers really mean. Just to give you some perspective, the most important, most prominent Danish economist, at least he tells me he is my longtime collaborator, Nikolai Foss, professor at Copenhagen Business School. And his greatest work, in my opinion, is the 2012 book he co-authored with me called Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment. And as you can see, we have received 504 citations. So we've received about 100th of the number of citations that Williamson's books have received. Now, to be fair, Williamson's books have been around for a little bit longer, but I'm not expecting our book to hit 44,000 or 51,000 in my lifetime or in 10 of my lifetimes. Stefan mentioned, and actually this was in the video I see, a couple of other Williamsonian concepts or terms. Williamson popularized the term opportunism to describe how people behave in organizational settings, in realistic settings. And the formal definition of opportunism is something like, this is what Williamson calls it, self-interest seeking with guile, meaning something a little bit stronger than just the normal economist assumption of self-interest. You can interpret this as saying that, look, not only will people try to act in their best interest, choose their highest valued goal on their preference ordering, that's how Austrian economists would say it, or maximize their utility, that's how neoclassical economists would say it. Williamson would go a little further and say, people will also sort of try to change the rules when they can to benefit themselves. Really all Williamson means here is theories of firms and organizations and economies that assume that everybody always follows through on their promises. You know, if I say I'm going to give a lecture for CPOS on the 23rd, I think it's the 23rd of October, I'm definitely going to do it. You don't even have to give a moment's thought to the possibility that I might back out, or I might call up Stefan the night before the lecture and say, yeah, I don't know if I really want to do this. Could we talk about, you know, some extra money? I mean, I didn't do that. And most people won't do that in a typical situation for reasons that we'll see. But some people might, right? And in writing contracts and setting up firms and designing organizations, you need to take seriously the possibility that someone might do something like that and have some remedies in mind or design things in advance to take that into consideration. That's what the assumption of opportunism means. Second core construct in Williamson's theory is what he calls asset specificity, which you could define as the extent to which assets can be redeployed to alternative users and uses. Talk a little bit more about this when we get to antitrust and platforms and data privacy and so forth. But you can imagine that, you know, in anticipation of the CPOS program for today, CPOS had to make some investments in infrastructure, getting the Zoom session and the technology set up. You've got some events there in person in Copenhagen. So there's facilities that have to be rented and equipment that has to be prepared. There are advertising materials that go out that have the names of all the speakers on them and the topics and so forth. If a speaker were to back out or threaten to back out at the last minute and the whole thing were to fall apart, some of the value of those investments would be lost, right? You can't print new brochures at the last minute. You can't redo the website and unsend all of those emails and resend out new emails with a different speaker lineup at the very last minute. If the company providing the cameras and the recording equipment and the lighting, for your meeting there in Copenhagen, if those providers were to back out, right, there would be some loss of that investment. Those investments are sunk at that point. There's nothing you can do about them. So going into an arrangement like this, there's some danger, right? The more specific you make these investments, the more the value of these investments depend on everybody doing what they said they would do and all of the complementary assets being present as promised. To the extent that that is risky, that you'll lose some of that value if somebody doesn't show up, if some complementary assets are withdrawn, that puts the party making those investments in some jeopardy, right? There's some potential harm that things could go sideways and you'll lose some of that value. So what does that mean? Does that mean that CPOS should not have had a website advertising this event because there's a risk things might change? Does that mean the organization should not have rented, made arrangements for an auditorium or a facility and had lights and cameras and should not have sent out emails and flyers because there's some hazard that one of us would have backed out? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is CPOS has got to build some flexibility or have some reason to think that that's not going to happen. So the core Williamson claim is that in the presence of asset specificity and uncertainty about the future, there are some hazards, contractual hazards. Some contracts that are made may not end up working out as planned. Some organizations may fail. Some arrangements may be at risk. So what do? Do you throw up your hands in disgust? Do you curl up into a little ball and cry and not try to do anything? No, what you do is design what Williamson would call some governance structures to try to mitigate or minimize or reduce the importance of opportunism in the face of asset specificity, right? So, for example, what could CPOS do to make sure that I myself or one of the other speakers, I see that my good friend, Professor Bjornskov, is also on the call. I mean, he's the one who's likely to renege, not me, right? What can they do to make sure or to protect themselves against one of us flaking out? Well, number one, we could have a formal written contract that says, if you give this talk, let's say that I were able to travel to Copenhagen, if we were doing this last year or something, they could have, we could sign a contract that says, if you travel to Copenhagen, we will pay your travel expenses and we'll give you a small honorarium. Okay. What guarantees that I will show up in Copenhagen? Well, nothing guarantees it, but it's much more likely that I will show up, or that if I travel to Copenhagen, that I will actually deliver the lecture because I want my travel expenses reimbursed, right? If I don't perform, I don't get the money. So that kind of a contract, a contingency contract that provides reimbursement or compensation only if certain behaviors are performed, is one way of governing that relationship, one way of increasing the chance that I'll perform and things will go well. But in this particular case, I don't think, in fact, we don't really have a formal contract. We don't need one because I know Stefan and many of the other folks at CPOS quite well. I know many of the other panelists. I mean, I'm not like a famous guy in Denmark or whatever, but I have good relationships with many professors at CBS and other people in the sort of pro-market community in Denmark and elsewhere in the Nordic countries and in all of Europe. And if I simply failed to show up without any good reason, that would be a black mark on my reputation. right? That would, then no one would ever invite me to these kinds of events in the future, and my friends would be embarrassed, and it just wouldn't be good for me. So reputation can also be a kind of governance structure or governance mechanism, right? So Williamson's famous book, Markets and Hierarchies, distinguished between the use of the reputation as an example of a market mechanism to minimize opportunism, formal hierarchies like vertical integration or very detailed contracts, and also what he calls hybrid forms like alliances and partnerships and so forth. These are ways of governing transactions to reduce the possibility of opportunism in the face of asset specificity. Now, key implication here is that, if you see, Klein and CPOS have some kind of complicated contractual arrangement with penalties and rewards, and maybe Bjornskov is also a party to that contract, and he and Klein have to synchronize their behavior somehow, otherwise some penalty kicks in or there's some other performance obligation. Those kind of complicated contracts do not look like the very simple exchanges that you find in a model of perfectly competitive behavior. So whereas many mainstream economists think any deviation from perfect competition must reflect monopoly power or market failure, Williamson's theory says, no, in the real world, businesses, firms, industries, consumers, suppliers will tend to work things out, sometimes in surprising ways, to try to lower transaction costs, to deal with opportunism. If you see vertical integration, it doesn't mean that a big firm is trying to leverage its monopoly upstream or downstream. It more likely means that there is some asset specificity on the table, and vertical integration is one way to get more efficiency, to increase efficiency, and get more value out of the use of those specific assets. Same with complicated contracts, like ones we'll talk about in just a moment, partnerships, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about my specific topic here. And Stefan or Sophie, I hope that you are monitoring the proceedings here. I know we have, if I recall, we have 1 hour reserved for this session, and I'd like to wrap up my remarks at quarter till or 10 till the hour, so we can have time for some Q&A. Let's talk a little bit about big tech. Regulation and antitrust concerns about big tech have been going on for years in Europe, in the US, elsewhere, partly on privacy issues, but also on competitive issues more generally. And of course, just this week, the US filed its antitrust suit against Google. A lot of these issues revolve around privacy and concerns for privacy, and that people aren't getting enough privacy and their privacy isn't being protected. I saw a tweet yesterday by a mainstream economist saying that privacy is a human right. Privacy is a fundamental human right, which must be protected at all costs. It's not at all clear what that means, but I'm not even sure that privacy per se is really an economic good. Is privacy something that you buy and sell in the market? I'm going to claim the answer is no, by analogy with information. For about the last 20 years or so, or 20 years or more, economists and other scholars have been developing theories and models and analyses of markets for what we call information goods. Information goods are things like books, movies, wiring and satellites and internet cable and fiber, people who offer consulting services, educational training programs. In other words, these are goods and services that are bought and sold in markets that embody information. In other words, if you buy a book like Hal Varian's book, Information Rules, or a more recent book by Josh Gans called Information Wants to be Shared, both of which I recommend. If you buy those books, you're not buying them because you want to touch the paper and rub the book against your cheek and so forth. You're buying it because you want to read it. I guess you'd probably be doing it on a Kindle anyway. You want to read it, you want to get the knowledge or the information that's contained in that book. But here's the critical point. We don't buy and sell information per se. disembodied information in the abstract. No, we buy specific, discrete, marginal units of books, movies, communications infrastructure, consultants, training programs, and so forth. Likewise, we don't buy and sell privacy in the abstract. We buy and sell what you might call privacy goods. I mean, sunglasses. I have these are regular glasses, but I have the kind of glasses that get dark when you go outside. And my glasses, they get really dark quickly when I walk outside. And when I go inside, it takes them a long time to get light. And so a lot of times it looks like I'm wearing sunglasses, even when I'm really not. And my colleagues like to tease me a little bit about like I'm a movie star or something. But if I really did have sunglasses, like you see Hollywood movie stars wearing when they go out to Starbucks, right? That's a way of trying to protect their privacy. Those black masks that the Antifa people wear are privacy goods, evil privacy goods. A disguise, putting locks on your windows or doors, window shades, putting a tall fence around your property, buying a bunch of land to keep other people from getting close to your house. These are goods and services that you buy because they give you privacy. In the electronic realm, encryption software, cookie blockers, or software like BleachBit. BleachBit became famous 4 years ago. That's the software that Hillary Clinton's people ran on the server that was in her basement to try to wipe it out and to like destroy all information that was on that hard drive. Those are examples of what I would call privacy goods or privacy services. And the point is, privacy goods and services can be analyzed just like any other economic goods, according to supply and demand. And do they get better or worse with technological change? And how does regulation affect them and so forth? Why do I make this point? It's because as soon as you start talking about privacy, you hear many people, even economists, say, well, normal economics doesn't apply in this case, right? Privacy is not just an economic good like tomatoes or automobiles. Privacy is a human right. That doesn't make any sense. You can't give somebody privacy, but you can provide someone with privacy goods or services in greater or smaller quantities, privacy goods and services with different attributes that work better or less well. And in fact, that's what happens in electronic markets all the time, right? In other words, if you look at products and services that are out there, electronic ones in particular, you find that entrepreneurs tend to offer bundled services that come with varying degrees of privacy protection, right? So, you could send all of your messages by Telegram or Signal or some other highly encrypted dark web kind of communications technology, and maybe some of you do. That's what the Antifa people do, supposedly. But most people don't. Most people use Gmail or Outlook or whatever because they find it's overall a better product for them, right? It's less secure than these super encrypted programs, but it's more convenient. It's easier to use, or more of your other friends use it. If you are on a regular social media platform instead of a highly encrypted one, it's because it's just more, you get more overall benefit out of it, even though it comes at the expense of less privacy. I just I saw something very recently about search engines. Well, we'll talk about search engines with Google in a second, but why does Google have such a large market share in search? There are lots of alternatives, including ones like DuckDuckGo, that market themselves on the privacy dimension, right? We don't have cookies, we don't collect information on you. Your data is safe and secure if you use DuckDuckGo, yet very few people use it. Why? Some people haven't heard of it. It's not installed on their computer. They don't know how to install it. But for most people, because they don't think it's as good. They don't think it works as well. They don't think the search results are as informative as the search results you get from Google, because Google has a much larger database from which it can, its algorithms can extract information. Ever since GDPR, thank you, Europe, it spilled over on us too. On any website, how many times do you have to click OK to accept the cookies? Most people just do it instinctively without paying any attention. But if you really care about your privacy, you ought to say no, 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 no on every one of those pop-ups. And if that means you can't access the website, well, that's the price you pay for keeping your data secure. Most people don't care enough to do that, right? You could encrypt all of your internet information using Tor or one of these other onion sites, but most people don't, right? In other words, sort of demonstrated preference suggests that most consumers are not willing to pay very much for privacy on the margin. Not many people are willing to pay an extra fee to use a more secure product or to accept, lower convenience or lower quality on other dimensions in exchange for more privacy. Right? If you really care about privacy in your messaging, what you should do is write your message on a little piece of paper and roll it up into a tube and put it in the back of a pigeon, a trained carrier pigeon, and then let the pigeon fly to its destination. I mean, that's way more secure than email. But nobody does that because it doesn't work as well on the whole, right? Don't put your information online, just put it on paper and pencil. Hardly anybody is willing to do that. One good example of that is these, contact tracing apps. It was thought in the beginning of the pandemic in March that, we don't need to enforce contact tracing. We just encourage people to download a contact tracing app and let their phone, their GPS data, their location data, tell the server exactly where they've been, and we can figure out who they've been in contact with and who needs to be isolated and so forth. Hardly anybody is using these apps because, for obvious reasons, they're creepy, right? Most of us don't care about COVID enough to say, I'm going to let either a government agency or big tech know exactly where I am at every moment. Okay, de facto, as a sort of a side point, there actually is a lot of privacy today. I mean, if you want to read an article on some topic you don't want other people to know about, I'm not going to say what it is, you want to watch a video, you would prefer other people not know that you're watching that video. Well, yeah, I mean, it's possible that Google is sort of spying on you or that Facebook or Twitter know what you are reading. But in the pre-electronic days, you'd have to go to a theater to watch that video and lots of people would know what you're doing. You'd have to buy that book in a bookstore. You'd have to read that thing in public, right? I mean, on balance, we probably have a lot more privacy today than we used to. And of course, the information that we give up to social media platforms, to Amazon, to Google, and so forth, we do so because we get something out of it. Right? It's more easy for sellers to find things that we will want and offer them to us and allow us to find them more easily than would be the case if we weren't able to share information. Think about dating sites or whatever. If the goal is to find a match on match.com, it's not going to work very well if the algorithm doesn't know what you like and don't like and whatever other attributes those dating sites want. I mean, to get a good match, you need a lot of information to be revealed by the participants. That's the whole point, right? We don't like the idea that big tech knows our medical history. We don't like the fact that big tech knows when we got a loan and how much we have on our credit card and so forth. But again, the reason that the companies want that information is not so they can, shoot you, right? It's so they can offer goods and services to you that will be more valuable. Right. And in fact, it's even if you think of medicine being exchanged on a market, which of course in many countries medicine is subsidized by or provided by the state. But if you imagine a market for medical services, it's actually a good thing if my health providers know that I had, that I'm a cancer survivor, or know that I have high blood pressure, or that I have this or that. I feel a little bit uncomfortable people knowing that, but it's better that my doctor knows it. It's better that my pharmacist knows it, probably in most cases, than if they don't know it. And there's really very little information, if you're on a technical point, that that sellers or platforms are using our private information to rip us off, to exploit more surplus from us through things like price discrimination. Now, specifically on privacy policy, these issues have come up in these congressional hearings, right? One proposed rule is that the government should mandate that your data be private, and they would do this by, for example, making it illegal for Twitter, Facebook, or Google, or Amazon to sell any of your browsing history or your purchase history to a third-party marketing firm, right? And of course, that is the whole business model on which Google operates, right? That the revenue that for Google's revenue comes from its advertising revenue, because it can offer to third parties the ability to target ads to you based on your browsing history. Another proposed rule is mandatory data portability. So like if I have used Google for the last 10 years and I decide, hey, I don't want to use Google anymore, now I'm only going to use Bing, which hardly anybody does. But if I decide I want to Bing things instead of Googling things, I should somehow be able to extract a file that has my complete browser history and search history and like import it into Bing. And then if I use Microsoft Edge with Bing, I should have exactly the same experience I had on Google. Or if you switch from, Facebook to Twitter, or from Twitter to Gab or Parler or one of these other platforms, you should be able to extract all of your interaction with that platform into a file, plug it into the new platform, and be able to have, like I say, the same experience. Also proposed maybe that a more traditional remedy is that companies get big stiff penalties or fines or punishments for data breaches. There have been a lot of data breaches in recent years. Maybe companies just aren't paying enough attention to keeping their data secure. If we fine them or penalize them or criminalize data breaches, they'll invest more, maybe. But the main point I want to make here, and to bring it back to Williamson, is to note that there are alternative models for how platforms collect information, what they do with that information, how they use the information, and these different models have benefits and costs. So all of these proposed privacy rules have costs as well as benefits, right? So some people say, well, look, if you knew that the search engine were forbidden from sharing your information with third parties, if you knew that you could always extract all your data and carry it to another provider, then those services would be much better and people would like them more. Okay, well, if that's true, then there's no reason why the market can't figure this out. In other words, why would it not be in the interest of entrepreneurs to offer products that have those features already? Why isn't the market responding to that desire if people actually have that desire? Well, the correct answer is probably that people don't have that desire. If they were aware of the trade-offs, how much worse the services would be to have those features. And which relates to the next point. I mean, imposing these kinds of rules would increase the cost of providing the service. And the platforms are not going to provide these services for free. I mean, they've got to have some way to raise revenue. So, would you pay a monthly fee? Would you pay 20 euros per month to be able to search on a search engine that works just as well as Google but has no ads? Look, I suggest if the answer is yes, then Google would have already offered you that option, right? Just like on plenty of platforms, Spotify, and I don't know, there are lots of platforms where there's a free ad-supported version or a paid non-advertised, ad-free version. Some people will pay to get rid of the ads. Some people would rather just watch the ads. And there's no sort of market failure involved there. There's no reason why the market can't just figure this out. And again, in practical term, people might not like what they see if the government forces platforms to offer these different kinds of privacy protection. Either you have to pay a fee, maybe there's different kinds of advertising, maybe more frequent or more intrusive advertising, if the platform cannot monetize its services by things like sharing information with third parties. What about Williamson's point? Well, think about Williamson's concept of asset specificity. What exactly is the asset that people are worried about? They say, well, if I'm on Facebook, let's say, Facebook has, my data. Facebook is controlling my data. It needs to give it back to me. I should own my data. Facebook can't use my data in a way that I don't approve. Well, what is, quote unquote, my data? What is this data that we're talking about? Well, it's a series of digital records of all of my interactions with the platform, my interactions with other people on the platform, other people's interactions with those interactions, and so on and so forth. It's a complex web of records that were not created by me, but were co-created by myself and the platform and all the other users on the platform. So, I mean, even ethically, legally, it's not clear who should have property rights over that thing, if property rights can even be defined over that thing. But that is, on specialized platforms, that asset, that record of all of your interactions with the platform is highly specific to the characteristics of that platform, right? In other words, to make it portable, it would have to be like, imagine an Excel spreadsheet that has, my name and every date, I guess date and timestamps and some little descriptor of those interactions, right? To make that data portable, it has to be so generic that it would work with anybody else's platform and anybody else's algorithm. So it could not incorporate any proprietary features, any complex coding that records interactions with the platform in a sophisticated or subtle way. It would have to be very, very low in asset specificity to be portable, which would make it a much less valuable asset, right? What incentive would the platform have to make your experience with the platform better if that involves any proprietary code or software or practices that would make the record of your interactions with the platform less portable, right? If portability is required, there's no incentive to try to improve the quality, or reduced incentives to try to improve the quality of the user experience, because doing so would make the record of the user's interactions with the platform more complicated, more relationship specific, and less portable and less valuable. Okay, and more valuable. So with these rules, there's no incentive to make the data more valuable. Okay, so that's a net loss. Just very briefly before we take some questions, it's very curious if you look at the antitrust case that was filed this week against Google in the U.S. It's almost identical to the Microsoft case from 25 years ago. The claim is that Google has a huge share of the search market, about 90% of the market for search, and even though that doesn't harm consumers because search is free and it works well, right? The claim is that Google is leveraging that, quote, monopoly on search to get people to use Android and to get people to use Google's other products and services, to get them on Chrome and so forth. So the idea is, all Android devices have Chrome as the default browser and Google as the default search. Lots of different, if you download Chrome on the Windows platform or on the Mac, on Mac OS or on Linux or whatever, it has Google search as the default search. Now, notice you can easily change these things. You can change the default search engine on an Android device to DuckDuckGo or to Bing or to anything that you want. Of course, you can download any browser. You can use Edge or Safari or whatever browser you want. You can easily change the default search, but because the presets, the things that come with the device, point you toward Google products and services, the Justice Department claims this is an illegal way that Google is leveraging its search monopoly to give it a bigger footprint on these other in these other areas. I mean, it's a very strange argument because number one, the switching costs are very low, as I just said. And number two, if it's the case that when Google negotiates with Samsung to put a version of Android on Samsung's phones, and the contract includes a requirement that Google search has to be pre-installed, rather than throwing up our hands and saying, oh my gosh, this must be some horrible, terrible monopoly behavior, we've got to stop it. If we put our Williamsonian hat on and reflect a little bit more broadly, we might say, maybe there's a good efficiency reason for this contract to look the way that it does. We shouldn't assume there's some kind of market failure. We should rather try to understand, how does this contract protect and encourage the creation of highly valuable assets that might be also high in asset specificity, right? And we all know that competition nowadays is often not between individual products, but between platforms, the Apple platform and the Google platform, with some services being available on multiple platforms. That's where a lot of the action is here, competition between ecosystems, if you like, and that's great, right? Even if the fact that once you're using one Google product, you're more likely to use other Google products, makes it look like the market for that product is not super competitive. The fact that you're competing for the ecosystems itself is another vibrant and rich form of competition. Maybe the ecosystem or the platform is the unit of analysis. So just to wrap up, just some more speculative legal and political notions. I'm not even sure that it really makes sense to say that we can own our data, because we can't really own information, right? You can own computers, you can have the legal rights to some data service that you contracted for, but you can't really own your data because data is not really an ownable thing. And keep in mind privacy, Stefan, you'll appreciate this is a Walter Block point. Privacy is really not something in your head. Privacy relates to what other people know about you, right? So, you can respect my privacy or not, but you can't really steal my privacy or take my privacy, because my privacy is something you already own. My privacy is what you know about me. It's not something I can claim that I have or claim that you took away from me.